Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from imposter syndrome to monogamy. If you can connect to the idea that despite living in the information age, life only seems to be making less sense, if you often find yourself confounded by the feeling that it just feels especially hard to exist as a human in the world right now, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to soften the clash between our innate human mysticisms and the overwhelm of this time. I'm your host, Amanda Montel. Today, we're overthinking about crushes. I have to make a bit of a confession. The idea for today's podcast episode occurred to me while I was a little bit tipsy, walking home all by myself from this tiny little old-timey bar in Asheville, North Carolina. A set of circumstances that set me up perfectly to indulge in a bit of overthinking about an old crush. Specifically, and this is kind of a dark story, the fact that my single most formative adolescent crush from middle school died a year and a half ago from a fentanyl overdose. I have not seen this person since I was 14 years old, but I can't stop thinking about how I'll never see him again. In a way, it almost felt like a piece of my girlhood was taken away from me when I got the news that he had passed away. And so tragically, too, he was only 31, and when I knew him, we met at theater camp. He was like the one cute straight boy at theater camp. It's a type. He just seemed like on top of the world, the dreamiest person alive. He was beautiful and funny and talented, and I didn't know a single girl at that camp who was not completely enamored with him. I think he really shaped the type of person that I would end up developing crushes on for the rest of my life. I found out about the death of this middle school crush of mine on social media. And that experience, in addition to just reflecting on how intense my feelings were for him when I was like 12, inspired me to want to explore further how infatuation and crushes are different now in the digital age. Crushes are already this overwhelming, all-consuming, anxiety-provoking, delusion-stoking experience, and I can't help but think that penchants for fantasy and romanticization about people are only exacerbated by social media. Stick around for my expert guest interview in a bit because I'm going to be speaking with Allegra Castens. She is actually an OCD specialist who focuses a great deal in her work on how forms of magical thinking show up in the context of romance and crushes in folks along the spectrum of neurodivergence. But first, I want to provide a little tiny bit of background on what a crush even is and how they form, because it's pretty fascinating how crushes can render even the most rational people alive completely delulu. I read in a 2022 piece on livingwithlimerence.com that crushes are basically the result of a cocktail of dopamine-driven reward, noradrenaline-driven arousal, and hormonally driven bonding, aka, quote, well-established neural systems that regulate mate-seeking behavior, unquote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, crushes tend to thrive in environments where there is more uncertainty about the other person's feelings toward you. This might explain why sort of avoidant, mysterious, too cool for school types are so often the subject of our enamoration. It happens because our reward systems can't predict the outcome of interactions with these people, so they keep us in this addictive state of reward and fear. Indeed, anxieties that our crush might find out about our feelings or not reciprocate them in juxtaposition with those intoxicating, crushy feelings keep us in this limbo state of, quote, tension, desperate for consummation, but sensing our crush is so powerful and disproportionate that it scares us into paralysis, unquote. This Living with Limerence piece also addressed the notion of types, the type of people that we tend to have crushes on, which, as it turns out, are shaped by a combination of nature and nurture. Factors from sensory ones to genetic ones to formative experiences we have during development create our romantic histories and preferences, and they can stick with us for a very long time. We as human beings tend to like having a type because it makes us feel like we can sort through all the potential matches more easily. It gives us a series of boxes to check off to help us categorize potential matches and make efficient decisions about them. However, it can also send us down a path of delulu. If we clock a person as our type based on some first impression of them, we might idealize them and project all this potential onto them, even though there might be little evidence to suggest that they really are the one. These behaviors are natural and healthy and common, but when a crush becomes overwhelmingly intense, that can escalate into something called limerence, which is actually one of my absolute favorite words. That's where infatuation with another person becomes obsessive and disruptive, sort of like a form of behavioral addiction. According to a New York Times piece by Amanda McCracken titled, "Is it a crush or have you fallen into limerence?" the subject of one's limerence, called the limerent object, is perceived as quote-unquote perfect but unavailable. This piece talks about how the term limerence was coined by an experimental psychologist and professor at the University of Bridgeport named Dorothy Tenov. And the difference, as she explains it, is that people who experience limerence ride this roller coaster of emotional highs and lows that is just more extreme than the average. This might cause them to interpret innocuous or random behaviors from their limerent object as purposeful, high stakes, life or death, almost in a conspiracy theorist style. Amanda McCracken writes that limerence toward a person can last many years, even while you're in a relationship with someone else. Most people who have limerence are serially limerent, having one limerent object after another, stuck chasing the same dopamine high felt in those initial stages. A fun fact about limerence: as my podcast coordinator Reese and I were preparing for this episode, she wondered how limerence might overlap with something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which is a common symptom of ADHD. She said, "I wonder if ADHD folks are predisposed to experience limerence." And apparently, after looking into it, they are. Dr. Louise Taylor, an Ireland-based therapist who specializes in treating neurodivergent patients, said in a Business Insider piece that while truly anyone can experience limerence, folks with autism and or ADHD are in fact more prone to it. As I mentioned, limerence can affect anyone, and most people probably do experience it to some degree at some point in their life. But I think with the introduction of social media and dating apps, limerence has become even more distorted, creating a sort of funhouse mirror version of it. I read this Teen Vogue piece by Mary Retta titled, "Why Your Internet Crush Can Be Stronger Than Your In-Person Feelings." And in it, she said that meeting online has actually become the most popular way that couples meet these days. It's actually become even more popular than meeting through friends. But those are crushes that actually transcended into IRL relationships. It's a lot harder to measure how dating apps and platforms like Instagram have increased people's proneness toward crushes, while inhibiting them from actually pursuing those relationships in person. Obviously, online, we are all incentivized to curate our best selves. There's a sort of baseline, mild degree of catfishiness. But for someone who experiences a lot of limerence already, that can just encourage more and more of those projections and fantasies. Not to mention that while crushes are already these addictive, dopamine-inducing experiences, so are phones. Together, that's a deadly pairing. To continue this discussion of crushes in the digital age, infatuation, delusion, connection, and loneliness, I'm thrilled to present today's special guest, Allegra Castens.
Hello, Allegra. Welcome to Magical Overthinkers.
This is the perfect podcast for me because all I do is overthink. So.
Well, you're in like-minded company. I actually know that we're extremely like-minded because when we were DMing about setting this up, we jinxed with every message.
So wild. And like reading your book, I feel like it was written for me. I honestly feel
Stop
like
that.
every single thing. It's wild.
That is so incredibly sweet and validating and lovely to hear. To start us off, could you just introduce yourself and your work to our listeners?
Absolutely. So my name's Allegra. I'm a licensed therapist and I specialize in the treatment of OCD, anxiety, and eating disorders. I'm also an author and I'm currently writing a memoir that's going to be published in the spring of 2026. So feels like a long time, but I'm sure it'll go by pretty quickly. I love mental health advocacy. And so being on Instagram and TikTok and really advocating for OCD and other mental health conditions is important to me. And yeah, I would say that's about it.
So I'm going to pose to you the first question that I pose to all of my magical overthinkers guests. It's simply, what is an irrational thought spiral that is currently living rent-free in your head?
It definitely has to do with dating. So, just reading your book, I have so much magical thinking around dating where I worry that if I don't fully believe it's going to happen, then I'm repelling it some way. It's kind of like manifestation of sorts or the law of attraction. Like if I'm not thinking that I'm going to meet someone, then I'm definitely not going to meet someone. And then also the zero sum bias. When I read that in your book, I died because every time I see on social media someone getting engaged, someone getting married, it feels like it is less of an opportunity for me. And I spiral so hard with that.
That is so fascinating to hear because it had never really occurred to me to think about zero sum bias in the context of dating, but zero sum bias absolutely connects to crushes because there was once a very real time in human history when you were in material competition with people in your small community for mates. And so someone else getting engaged or whatever the equivalent of that was in the Neolithic period, that would be a threat to you. And we're now mapping those instincts onto a much bigger world where like somebody across the country getting engaged to someone you've never met and would not be someone you would compete with them for can still feel very threatening to you.
It's wild too. Like even someone that I wouldn't want to be with myself, it still feels like love is just a scarce resource.
Yes, yes, which is such an unpleasant and fallacious notion. You know, I'm glad you mentioned dating because it perfectly ties into the subject at hand.
Yes.
And you, as an OCD specialist, are such an interesting person to address this topic because I do feel like no matter what state of rationality or mental health you find yourself in, crushes are one of the most all consuming, obsession inducing, delusion inspiring experiences a person can have. Like, it can truly bring even the most left brained, logical, pro con list, what have you person to their knees into the world of Delulu. I was wondering if you could explain what in the brain slash body are responsible for these obsessive compulsive crushy feelings. And is there an adaptive reason for why crushes often drive us nuts?
I'll start with the what's happening in the brain and body. So when it comes to crushes, they activate reward and then stress regions in the brain. So both of those things. And with that initial spark or attraction or even crush with another person, there's a particular region of the brain that recognizes potential reward and then floods the brain with dopamine. And that is that feel good chemical that contributes to that happiness, the really giddy, euphoric feelings that we have when we have a crush. Even just thinking about a crush can bring up those feelings. And that can flood the brain and the body with dopamine. If we think about something like cocaine, the drug, that also floods the reward pathways of the brain with dopamine, and the person wants more and more. So, obviously, cocaine and drugs and crushes are not the same thing, but it makes sense as to why someone would keep thinking about a crush and be motivated to pursue that because it feels so good. It can feel like a high. So if dopamine floods the body, we are motivated to maintain that crush. And then that motivation to maintain it can sometimes lead to obsession.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a crush does feel like an addiction to a person.
Oh, for sure.
Thank you for explaining all of that. I want to ask, how do our tendencies toward crushes fade or change as we age? Because, I mean, my crushes as an adolescent were all consuming. And as it turns out, I am engaged to a person that I had a crush on when I was a teenager. And I'm pretty sure that I was one of his first crushes. No, I like know that as a fact.
Wait, that is so beautiful. Now my brain's like, how do I make that happen?
Dip into your yearbook.
That's amazing.
No, but I feel like I've never really been able to shape my childhood crushes. Like they shaped me so much. But then as you get older, you obviously have like more to worry about than crushes and your hormones change. But then as an adult, when you do get one of those intoxicating, addictive, like dopamine flooding crushes, you're like, whoa, I feel like a fucking teenager. Like I am just this animal. Like I thought I was this professional adult, but no. Can you talk about hormonally, culturally,
Yes.
psychologically, what is going on in the difference between crushing as a young person and a slightly older person?
Okay, so I think in young adulthood, let's say adolescents, teenagers, the experience of having a crush is newer. And adolescents tend to be going through puberty, so there's a lot of different kind of hormonal changes happening in the body, and I think that can make the feelings so much more intense than we might feel having a crush as an adult. They can definitely be similar, but I think the newness and the puberty just makes it a lot louder. And I was thinking about this even in terms of myself. I think adolescents are a lot less jaded than adults are.
The word jaded just came into my mind. They're not going to question or be cynical about a crush. They don't have the prefrontal cortex for cynicism quite
Well,
yet.
that's exactly it. So if we're thinking about development, the brain is still developing for the young adult, and it might be easier to project fantasies onto a crush that you have as a teenager because you haven't really dealt with the reality of heartbreak and the god-awful dating pool. So it's easier to see this person as someone who is perfect. And I think as we get older, hopefully what happens is we are less likely to project those fantasies onto another person. We're able to see the crush more realistically. It doesn't mean that we don't feel those feelings, but we can see, okay, wait, I am making up something that doesn't exist right now. Like, yes, this man is an author, but that doesn't mean that he is the kindest person to ever exist. And he's Gandhi and he donates all his money to charity and like all of the things that we might have done when we were younger and just thought everyone was wonderful.
Yeah. You probably project and magically overthink in the context of crushes differently depending on your relationship experience. So, like,
For sure.
I was in a really toxic, fucked up relationship for all of my early adulthood until I was almost 26. And once I was freed from that relationship, or freed myself, I guess, I shot out of that relationship like a cannon. And I was like, I was really trying to make up for lost time, right? And that relationship was so wrong for me. It felt like getting out of it was an opportunity to pursue like the perfect relationship, even though that doesn't really exist. And so, yeah, I would like exactly come across someone on Hinge whose job description was like writer, which in LA, like, what does that even mean?
No,
Sometimes
everyone's a writer and model.
everyone's a writer, exactly. And I would be like, oh my god, I'm gonna find the John Donne to my Joan Didion in this man. You know, like it was so delusional.
No, it really is. And I think, like, I know we're going to talk about this, but I think that the dating apps make it worse. And honestly, for many reasons, I just can't be on them. I really tried over
Yeah.
the weekend to get Bumble again. And I said, look, just like give it after 5 hours, I deleted it. I just can't do it. And that's one of the reasons is we just can't tell who a person is by seeing a picture of them online.
Okay, I want to ask way more about dating apps. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about the fantasy aspect. I think most of us probably know someone who is super prone to those one-sided crushes that never turn into relationships. Maybe it is you yourself, listener, or maybe it's your best friend, or maybe it's your frenemy. I certainly know my fair share of people who crush really, really hard, who like jump to conclusions about their crushes, but they're kind of perma-single. Like they never pursue them any further. I don't have an articulate way of presenting this question, but like, why are they like that?
You're like, what? Diagnose them.
Yeah, like what is going on with people who crush so, so, so hard, but can't bring themselves into reality enough to like actually pursue something?
There are probably so many different answers to this question. And when I was thinking this question through, the biggest thing that came up for me was probably protective factors. I think crushes are typically one sided until we make it two sided or we tell the person that we have a crush on them and they reciprocate or don't. So I think having a crush that is one sided can feel protective. So
Mhm.
it's easier to crush on someone maybe who's implausible, someone that you know that you can't have because you don't have to take that risk. You don't have to be vulnerable and risk getting hurt. And there's a kind of certainty in that. It's like, this is a one-sided crush. I know it's never going to happen. So I'm going to keep crushing and I don't have to risk actually being with this person and getting hurt. So I see it as a very protective factor for people.
Yeah. But crushes can be so painful. Like, it's
Yes.
all
It's
painful.
like, why would you do that? And that also brings you back to, in talking about like what crushes do to the brain, there also is the stress response that gets activated when we have a crush. So it's not all euphoria and giddiness. There's a lot of cortisol that gets flooded in the body as well when someone has a crush, and that fight or flight can get activated. And that can lead to a person not sleeping. It can impact them physiologically. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about why would someone want a one-sided crush. Yes, it might be stressful, but also it might feel easier than having to actually pursue something with someone.
True. And like, if you're busy managing all of those hormonal responses, that's already a full plate.
No, it absolutely is.
Oh my God. I've had some really fucked up crushes in my day, but it is such a trip to think like that body experience that you're having that feels so real because
Mhm.
of those hormones. It's like just the result of a bunch of fictions that you told yourself
Yes.
about your relationship with this person that doesn't exist.
Yes. And it's a lot of us projecting things onto them, like our desires, our wishes, our values, what we want out of a person and life. And I think that crushes can also bring up a lot of feelings of abandonment, rejection, anxiety, low self esteem. And if someone is already struggling with those things, like a fear of rejection or low self esteem, it would also make sense that pursuing a crush would be difficult.
Right, pursuing it. Yeah, no, just having it as a fantasy. It's almost like being a fan of a pop star, which like is Delulu, but it feels so good. And there's something about that unpredictability of the stress and the reward or whatever that
That's exactly
is,
what it is.
yeah, so intoxicating. So I want to talk about the role of dating apps and social media because I think of times when I was on Hinge and girl, I was on motherfucking Hinge. Like I made it my full-time job. It's like it was LinkedIn to me. Here I am applying for jobs, like I am
Really.
my type A ass was all over Hinge. But I would like read things into the shitty little not that deep Hinge message correspondences that were so not there. And we can talk about your experience. I would love to hear more about that. But I'm curious just for your top level takes about how social media and dating apps have changed our experience of crushes. How has that sort of fucked this whole very human experience up?
I think that social media and dating apps have made crushes more intense and absolutely more delusional. I think because there's more material to fantasize about and to project our desires onto, our dreams, our hopes, etc. Like when we think that we know someone because we've seen a picture of them on Hinge or an Instagram story, we think that we know everything about them. Our brain wants to formulate that full picture, but the reality is most people posting on Hinge or posting on Instagram are posting a very curated image of themselves that is not even their own reality. But we have access to that, so we think, I know this person fully. They got coffee in the morning. They must be someone who loves to read a book with coffee at the park. And then you get to the people viewing your stories, right? We now have access to who views and likes our content. And I think that has made us more delulu. Like Johnny watched my Instagram story. He's in love. It's like, no, Johnny was swiping through all the other stories and yours came up, or like so and so didn't like my Instagram. He hates me. He no longer has a crush on me. It's like we read so much into these things that don't exist.
Totally. There's just more fodder. Cause I remember obviously I remember pre-social media crushes. And I remember crushes in the age of Facebook when all there was Facebook, but like you knew those people in real
Yeah.
life. That's why they were your Facebook friends.
Mm-hmm.
And all of your projecting and fantasies, which 100% were there, could kind of be quelled or like brought back down to earth when you interacted with that person IRL. Cause like even them smiling at you or not being nice to you, whatever, those small interactions were enough to be like grounding, like, oh, this is how this person feels about me, or this is actually what our dynamic is. But because now with dating apps and social media, you can develop crushes on limitless people nearly that you never meet, what a distraction from pursuing real life connections.
Could not agree more. I was just having this conversation with someone. I personally, and this is just my opinion, feel like dating apps and even social media have ruined dating. I think it can really help people to be online. But I think, especially for people who are prone to overthinking, dating apps have just not been my friend. We are not meant to be swiping and swiping and swiping and swiping for love. And I also think, yes, we project onto people and we project our values and whatever. But I also think we sometimes miss really wonderful people because they
Yeah.
don't live up to our projection or our fantasies when we see a picture of them on social media. Like, nobody that I have dated in the past, I would never in a million years have swiped for them on a dating app ever.
Dude, okay. So again, the person to whom I am engaged, who I've known since middle school, it's a long story, but the first time we reconnected as adults, he was single, I was single. And I was like, are you on dating apps? Let me see your Hinge. And he was not a heavy user of dating apps, unlike me. And in my defense, I think part of the reason why I was so very into dating apps is because I was single for the first time in my adult life at the
Yeah.
age of 25. So I was just really curious about this whole new world that had developed. But yeah, I was, looking at his Hinge, and it occurred to me that I would have never come across him on my Hinge because simply of the age settings. Like, in my mind, I thought I only want to date someone older, but he's a year and a half younger than me. I relate to what you're saying, and I too am an overthinker and a fantasizer and a dreamer and any thought spiraler and all these things. So I want to hear more, if you're willing to share, about your personal struggles with overthinking and crushes in the age of dating apps, and sort of some of the conclusions that you've come to for how to approach your own dating life as a result.
I think I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that more times than not, that has like bitten me in the ass. I'm sure there are wonderful people on the apps. I unfortunately just have not met them. So I think I go into it finding one little thing, like they'll say reads books. And then I have this whole fantasy about what a kind, wonderful, loving person that they are. And then I'm met with WYD at 11:30 p.m. So I think that I want to see the best in people. I love love and I really want to get married, and I want all of those things because I am so prone to like daydreaming and fantasy and desiring these things. I just think I need to meet someone in person where very quickly I have that reality check of this is who that person is.
Yeah. Oh my God. Just thinking about the way that people have always found mates who were attracted to and who we could get along with enough to procreate, spend some time with, whatever you want to do. They've always been people who were like low key, probably our third cousins. You know what I mean? Like, there were people who we had a lot in common with. And I remember in the early days of dating apps, when I was just hearing about them, not using them because I was in the prison of that relationship. I'm fine. I remember thinking like, oh, how great. You have limitless options. We're really widening our dating pool as if that was some kind of good thing. But it's like chooser's paradox. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work, is because there's just this overwhelm of people. It's like you walk down the cereal aisle and there are too many options, fucking Tricks and Cookie Crunch and whatever, and you end up walking away from the cereal aisle with nothing in your cart at all because there were just too many choices. And the people that I dated from dating apps, they had been on apps for a long time, and I felt like that was a red flag. They had just like gotten into this habit of being like, oh, there's one problem with this girl, I'm gonna Amazon Prime a new person the next day. There's just this limitless choice aspect that is, I think, really at odds with the way that we've always made decisions about anything at all, including and especially our mate. It's just like so unnatural.
Yeah, no, it's too much. I could not agree more. And I think sometimes, yes, I think there's the pursuit of perfection where you want the perfect partner. And if there's one thing on their profile or one thing on that date, it's like, let's swipe again. Or I think, which this might be a judgment of my own that I should work on, when I get back on the apps after like a year and see the same people, I'm like, what is wrong with you that you're still on these things?
Yeah. No,
Which
I think the same
a
thing.
terrible judgment, but I keep getting hit with like the same Mikey. And when it's like, Mikey, babe, you've been on the app for 4 years. Like, is there something wrong with you? Or like, do you just want perfection? And again, I have friends who have met their person on apps, and I think that's wonderful.
Same.
I just think in terms of evolution and the adaptive nature of dating and having like apps just don't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, it reminds me of how like Duolingo is actually not an effective way of learning a language. It's just kind of a language themed iPhone game.
Yes.
Hinge and other dating apps are not really an effective way of finding a mate. They're just a dating themed iPhone game.
Yes, I could not agree more. And it feels like less romantic to me, which I know I need to just like, it is totally romantic for people, but I just want to meet someone in the wild. But then that's where I'll spiral further because I'm like, okay, if I want to meet someone in the wild, do I need to be like going to new coffee shops and sitting at the bar? So then I like plan my whole, like, it's just, it gets nuts in my brain.
Now I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to set you up. Couple more questions. And then we're going to get to a little bit of a lightning round where I had a bunch of listeners submit some of their irrational thought spirals on the topic of crushes, and I'm going to ask you to react to them. But my next question is simply, when might a crush cross over from maybe a little bit obsessive, maybe a little bit delulu, but ultimately healthy and human to not so healthy, perhaps interfering negatively with your life?
So this made me think of a term called limerence. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before.
I love that term.
Okay, yeah. So it was coined by Dr. Dorothy Tennov in the 70s, and it really describes being obsessed with a person or obsessive infatuation with another person. And that other person would be called the limerence object. And it's typically one-sided, not reciprocated, but it also feels involuntary to the person, like it's intrusive. They might not even want to be thinking about that other person, but it just keeps coming up in their brain. And they find themselves constantly ruminating about that person, mentally reviewing interactions with that person, so much so that it impairs their functioning. They feel like they can't stop thinking about the limerence object, and that impacts their ability to work, to go to school, to maintain relationships with others. And that would be an unhealthy crush. And even if it's not limerence, if you find that you just cannot stop thinking about someone, so much so that it's impairing how you go about your day, I think that that would be time to look at what's going on. Infatuation and having a crush, of course, can be healthy, but there's also typically that I can set that aside and move about my life. If you can't set that aside ever, that's probably bordering on the unhealthy territory.
Yeah, because at that point, I mean, whether you can't stop thinking about a crush or someone who harmed you, like that's threatening. And that has something to do with something else, not that person anymore.
Or if there's excessive daydreaming and fantasizing, which a lot of people do when they have a crush. But if you find that you're sitting at your work desk and then 3 hours have gone by because you're daydreaming about your wedding with this person, probably not super helpful if you have a job to do.
It really, in the age of social media, like these behaviors really remind me so much of superfan behaviors, stan behaviors toward pop stars and celebrities, when you were talking about seeing a photo on Hinge of someone reading a book and jumping to the conclusion that like he speaks French. I'm like, he's worldly and yeah, like we're gonna be literature cuties together forever. Like
All I want.
yeah, that is the halo effect, right? Like that is the bias that I talk about in the first chapter of The Age of Magical Overthinking, which is our tendency to admire one quality in a person and jump to the conclusion that they must be perfect overall, which relates to how we find role models. It also relates to parasocial relationships with celebrities. And it can be really dehumanizing in a way because you're not making room for someone's errors and complexity and the full scope of their humanity. And I typically think of the halo effect and its negative repercussions in the context of like Swifties and similar superfans. But I'm really hearing it apply to these parasocial digital age crushes also. Wild. Before we get into these thought spirals, I would really love to hear about your work treating patients whose OCD manifests in their relationships and crushes.
Yes. So when I tend to think of crushes and the impact of them on OCD, I think about relationship OCD, which is a subset of OCD. It's an obsessional theme that entails repetitive and unwanted intrusive thoughts or images about the rightness of one's relationship or partner. So that might look like, what if my partner is not the one? What if I don't love my partner enough? Or even, is my child smart enough so it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship? And the obsession is ego dystonic, meaning the person does not want to be experiencing it. It's opposite to their values, self-concept, and what they know. But it just is so repetitive and it keeps popping into their mind that they perform compulsive rituals, whether that's mental or physical rituals to alleviate anxiety, resolve the obsession, seek certainty, resolve the doubt, etc. And with relationship OCD in particular, what I see is having a crush becomes evidence in the person's mind that their OCD is actually reality, that they shouldn't be with their partner and that their
Mm.
partner is not the one, because having a crush on someone else is a bad thing. It means that they're not really in love with their partner, which obviously is super
Mm.
illogical. But for the person with relationship OCD, it can feel like evidence that their OCD is true when it's not. So I do a lot of psychoeducation for people with relationship OCD, just about what's normal within relationships. Like, it's okay to find someone else attractive, so long as you're not actively pursuing that. If you're in a monogamous relationship, it's okay to feel boredom sometimes in relationships. That doesn't mean that you're in the wrong one. So when I think about crushes, I often think about that aspect, or limerence, which is not OCD, but it can have an OCD flair. Relationship OCD can also latch on to another person. So it might be like, what if my partner doesn't love me enough? But that doubt is obsessional, meaning it's not rooted in reality. We wouldn't actually see someone who's with a person that is abusing them or treating them poorly. It's like they clearly are loved by their partner, but their brain keeps going, what if your partner doesn't love you? There's also something that people with OCD can deal with that is called retroactive jealousy. And ultimately, what that entails is sometimes a person finds that they can't stop thinking about their partner's past sex life or romantic life, and they don't want to be, but they feel that overwhelming jealousy and they're thinking about it constantly, and it can impair their relationship with their partner. What's hard is it is involuntary for the person. It's like they say, I don't want to be thinking about this. I think it's perfectly acceptable for my partner to have had past sexual experiences, but my brain just keeps bombarding me with those experiences. And I feel that like fight or flight come up when my brain does that.
Yeah, so you mentioned that limerence can have a bit of OCD flair. So I'm wondering, can people who do not have OCD experience OCD-esque symptoms with regard to crushes more than maybe other areas of life?
That's a really great question. And the answer is yes, because you can ruminate and not have OCD, right? Like people with eating disorders ruminate, people with social anxiety ruminate. So ruminating about a crush is not inherently OCD. Or even being infatuated with a person is not inherently limerence. So we can see this like extreme infatuation and daydreaming and rumination and perseverating, and that can happen for people without OCD. When someone has OCD, their obsessions are unwanted, they're distressing, they impair the person's functioning, and the obsessions and compulsions take up an extended period of time throughout the person's day. Does that make sense?
Totally, totally. Yeah. Well, is OCD a spectrum?
That is a really great question. So, having an OCD diagnosis, there is like you can have light, medium, moderate, severe OCD, but OCD is not like a personality trait that we all live with. It's not like everybody has a little bit of it. You have to meet criteria for the condition. And then if you meet criteria, there is like moderate, severe, etc. And someone with severe OCD might have obsessions and compulsions like 24/7. OCD is so misunderstood. And I think where it's hard to thinking about it in terms of crushes is OCD is ego dystonic. Like I said, the person doesn't want to be thinking about it. There's not necessarily that like reward response. It's I'm having this horrific thought that I can't get out of my brain. When someone has a crush, it feels like pleasurable to them.
Yeah.
And that's not the experience of someone with OCD. This is so intrusive and so unwanted.
Totally. Thank you so much for clarifying that. The last question I want to ask you before these thought spirals is what advice might you offer someone who feels like their crush habits are interfering or intruding in their life in a way that doesn't feel so healthy for them?
I would say start with self compassion. I know I felt shame in the past for being like obsessed with a person or having my brain fixate on something. And there's nothing wrong with you if that's what you're experiencing. Seeking professional help with a therapist can also be super helpful. Even if it's not OCD or limerence, it can just be helpful to work with someone who can help you cut down on the rumination and the fantasizing and the daydreaming. I would also say try to see your crush to the best of your ability through the lens of reality. Instead of projecting this fantasy, what do I actually know about this person and what is totally made up in my mind?
Oh my God, if you're a list maker, you could make a list of some real qualities that I'm telling you, I was just talking about this the other day. do not sleep on a freaking pros and cons list. Do not sleep on like a gratitude list, on a goals and values list, and maybe in this context, a list of things that you know for sure about this person.
1,000%. That can be super helpful. And cutting down on the fantasizing, the daydreaming. And that might be like giving yourself 20 minutes during the day, like scheduling a daydreaming period so that you're not doing it all day long. Because crushes, of course, can take over, but they shouldn't impair our functioning.
Totally. There was a phrase that I came across while researching that celebrity worship chapter of my book, talking about like some of the negative side effects of celebrity worship. And one of them was called maladaptive daydreaming, which is just a phrase
Like
that I feel
me.
like, yeah,
Yes.
I know. I mean, so relatable. Also, such a beautiful and sort of poetic phrase. Daydreaming is so romantic, and maladaptive is so like clinical sounding. Now we are going to get into some thought spirals submitted by listeners on the topic of crushes. So I'm just going to read these thought spirals and you're going to lend your instinctive reaction.
Okay.
First thought spiral. Why do I crush on people I know I'll never date and don't want to?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Again, I might just be seeing this through the lens of protectiveness because of like trauma and therapy and whatever. I think to a certain extent that might be easier because you know that you can't have them. There's no risk there. Like
Yeah.
you are certain that you don't want that person and that you can't have them. That is so much less vulnerable than having a crush on and pursuing someone who might be available to you.
100%. It reminds me of like dreaming of some career that you know is so unrealistic. You know, like, again, I live in Los Angeles. So there are a lot of people who like dream of winning an Oscar, but they've literally taken 0 steps to pursue anything resembling that.
Yeah.
And that feels safer than like the boring, tedious grunt work of like getting headshots taken, making an LA casting profile, doing some projects that probably aren't that inspiring and are not Oscar worthy at all. But like, those are the steps you have to take. Yeah. Fantasy feels safer,
It's
obviously.
safer, totally.
Next thought spiral. How many people in committed relationships still get crushes?
I would say probably almost everyone, or at least is attracted to other people. Having a crush again doesn't mean that we're actively pursuing them, but it might just be like you finding someone attractive at work or whatever it might be. And it's not everyone, of course, but I think a lot of people. And I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with finding someone else attractive unless you are crossing boundaries that have been established in your relationship.
I came across a term the other day, a portmanteau, my favorite form of wordplay, that sort of tickled me and also disturbed me. I don't know. The term was polyamorous, which is a portmanteau of polyamorous and tolerate, because there are certain relationship situations where like you're in a monogamous relationship, but you know your partner is kind of like stepping outside the bounds of that and you don't talk about it, but you just sort of tolerate it.
That sounds traumatizing.
Yeah, it does. This is not a thought spiral submitted by a listener, but what you were saying in response to that one made me think of it. I mean, this is another topic for another day, probably, but I wonder if like asexual slash demisexual people experience crushes, and if so, how?
That's a really good question. And you're right. I think when I said almost everyone, it definitely isn't everyone. So like that's a great question. I would say, well, I think that there are also different kinds of crushes, right? Like even in young adulthood, it could be like there are identity crushes where maybe you feel really bonded to someone that you look up to and you want to be, or it could be a romantic crush, or it could be a sexual, like sometimes we have crushes on people that we don't want anything sexual from.
Oh my God, yeah, I have experienced those. I mean, when I was in high school, I had myself convinced that I had like a major crush on my gay best friend, and he was gay, and he was also convinced that he had a crush on me, and we like tried out some things, and let me tell you right now, that was gross. That was bad. And we realized there are just so many ways to be attracted to someone. And yet the culture basically says that if you are attracted to someone, well, that's romantic and thus sexual, and you should pursue it in that way. But I think he and I were just sort of like intellectually and spiritually and artistically attracted to each other. And we confused that as like a sexual thing, and it went really bad. We're still close, though.
No, 100. There are so many different kinds of crushes.
Yeah, such a good point. Okay. Next thought spiral goes, I still think of a crush I had at 23 before I met my husband. He was a great friend to me. I'm 37 now. Yeah, this relates to another question I wanted to ask you, which is
Yes.
like, why do our early crushes, our formative crushes, stay with us forever?
I think there's a lot of like identity development that happens during childhood and adolescence. And like we talked about earlier, the brain is still developing and we're developing a sense of self. So I think sometimes having an unrequited crush can really impact us during those developmental stages. Like, I remember I had this crush on this boy Tyler in like first grade. It's the most I barely just told my therapist this, so I can't even believe I'm saying this. On Valentine's Day, I like got him a teddy bear and gave it to him. Horrible in front of like the whole class.
Sweet thing. Oh my gosh.
This is why I'm still single now. But I couldn't even tell my therapist about that. That's how much it still bothers me because that was during such a developmental stage. And I think, as dumb as it might sound, I think that that probably plays a role in the way that I feel about myself dating. Like, it felt like rejection, it felt like abandonment. So when our brain is developing and neural pathways are being wired and we have those kinds of crushes, they can deeply impact us and we can still think about them later on because they might have been super formative for
Yeah,
us.
totally. Next thought spiral. Is my crush being nice to me because they're nice or because they like me?
Oh, I don't know, girl. I wish I knew. That's a really hard one to answer. People can just be nice. People can be flirty. I think that they would probably have to do a deeper dive into what's actually happening. Because being nice to someone doesn't mean that you have a crush or you're flirting. Like, I'm nice to my barista and like, God bless them, but like, I'm not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And everybody flirts in different ways and everybody is nice for different reasons. Next thought spiral. Why do I lose myself in becoming who I think my crush wants me to be?
Wow, that's another really great one. I would say, first thing, is it actually who the crush wants them to be, or is that what they're projecting onto that person? Because if it's something that we're projecting onto that person and we think Tyler wants an X, Y, and Z person, and then we start to become that, I would look at, is that actually what they want, or is that fantasy? And then I think sometimes, as human beings are so hardwired for connection and even sometimes feel desperate for love, that we will try to become the person that someone else wants because that's how badly we want to be connected.
And it's the scarcity mindset that you mentioned at the very beginning.
A million. It's like, well, what if there's no one else out there? Let me just adapt myself.
Oh my God, I have done that so many times.
Yeah, where I'm like doing things that I just like don't even, I don't know, pretending to like anime or it's like I don't like anime.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh my God. I had to learn so much about fish, the band, not the seafood, in order to keep the guy I lost my virginity to in my little black book, so to speak. It's like I could have just moved on. But in my mind, there weren't enough fish in the sea.
Oh,
I apologize for that. Okay. Next thought spiral. Is it true that crushes are just a lack of information?
oftentimes, yes. I think yes, because it's what we're projecting onto the other person and it says more about us than it does them. Unless you have a crush on someone that you actually do know really well. I think it depends on the
Right.
kind of crush. Like, if this is a good friend of yours that you've known for 5 years and you developed strong feelings, and then you have a crush on them, that feels a bit different than like, this is a dude who I added on Instagram and think I know everything about.
Okay, a couple more thought spirals. This next person says, am I asexual? I learned I was experiencing comphet. What if I've never actually had a crush? So comphet, I think, stands for compulsory heterosexuality.
So they're saying, I discovered I'm compet. What if I've never had a crush?
Yeah, like I learned I was experiencing compulsory heterosexuality, aka just like all the influences in the culture and in your family or whatever that might tell you that like other forms of sexuality don't exist.
I mean, I don't know if that person's asexual or not. I definitely can't answer that question. What I will say is, when we're taught that heterosexuality is the norm, we might not allow ourselves to experience crushes of other kinds.
Can my crush tell I have a crush on them? How embarrassed should I be about this?
I mean, if if it's Tyler receiving the teddy bear, yes.
Oh, you poor thing.
If you're, liking all of their social media posts and you're messaging them, yes, I think sometimes.
Oh my God, I can immediately tell when someone has a crush on me, but I think it's only because there is only one very specific type of person that has a crush on me.
That's what kind of person?
This is a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. It's specifically 44-year-old men.
I'm not opposed. I mean,
No, I love 44-year-old men. And I just do this Pavlov's dog thing where I immediately start flirting with them, even though I don't want to. That is a whole nother thing. Are chronic crushes that never go anywhere just a way of avoiding intimacy?
absolutely could be. Yes.
This thought spiral says, I imagine them watching me constantly, and that gives me anxiety and shame about being human, about showering, about going to the bathroom, etc.
Oh, that sounds hard. It sounds like that's where it maybe has become unhealthy. Like it doesn't feel good to the person. Like that daydreaming, that fantasizing, that imagining them, watching them.
Yeah. Once you start feeling ashamed of taking a shit because you're like, I don't want my crush to know about this, that's when it maybe has crossed over.
We've entered Delulu territory.
Totally. 2 more thought spirals. Do you think a friendship is salvageable after admitting a crush?
I do.
Last one. Now that I'm an adult, I feel like I can't even tell if I have a crush on anyone. When I was 13, it was so awkward and obvious to me who I had a crush on, even if it was a person I just thought was cute and never really spoke to. I can remember being in middle school and having obsessive crushes, stalking Facebook, staring at pictures in yearbooks, trying to look cute to get their attention. Now that I'm an adult, I feel like I broke my crushing skills. I have the time and social skills to do something productive about having a crush, but my ability to have one is gone, it seems. I don't even longingly scroll through 75 weeks of someone's Instagram feed anymore. I'm not asexual. I just feel like no one does it for me like they used to.
That might go back to what I talked about. As we get older, we tend to project fantasies onto other people less. So I would say maybe this person just hasn't met someone that, I mean, I haven't had a crush in a while, so I relate.
I recently rewatched the movie 8th Grade. It's so good. It's directed by Bo Burnham. It's such a gem of a film. It's a very, very realistic portrayal of this one 8th grade girl living in 2017 or whenever it was. But the 8th grade boy that she has a crush on is such a little punk ass motherfucking twerp.
Yeah.
But she's 13 years old. So his one little hair flip is going to do it for her. It's,
a million%.
We just have better taste now.
We do. And I think we've also gotten used to those feelings, right? I remember when the person I had a crush on in middle school, touched my arm, and it's you're feeling that arousal for the first time. I think that we've all, or not all, but some of us have felt that in our later years. So it just doesn't feel as enticing or as exciting.
It is true. Novelty is such a part of it. And there's less and less that really feels truly new anymore.
Right.
But you can find it. I have faith. Okay, Allegra, my very last question for you is, what do you think is the number one thing that we're overthinking when it comes to crushes? And what is the number one thing that we're underthinking?
Okay. I would say overthinking who they are as a person. I think that is the number one thing that happens when we have a crush, all of that projection. Underthinking, I think sometimes, I don't know if this is the biggest thing, but underthinking our own worth and our lovability, desirability. I think that tends to happen for people with crushes too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. If folks want to keep up with you and your work, where can they find you?
So at Allegra Castins on Instagram and TikTok.
Thank you again.
You're so welcome.
And thank you, listeners, so much for being here. Now's the part of the episode where I share a little tidbit of evidence-based advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This one is a pretty common grounding exercise that I have used multiple times. Many of you might have heard of it already, but I think it's worth the reminder. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 method. When you feel stuck in a thought spiral, it can be helpful to ground yourself in a sensory experience to remind you of what's real and that you're safe in this moment. If you're feeling anxious, panicked, proverbially stuck in your own head, you start by identifying 5 things in your environment that you hear, 4 things that you see, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And no piece of sensory input is too small. During super urgently unpleasant thought spirals, I have found the 5-4-3-2-1 method provides a little crumb of relief. Thank you all so much again for listening, and until the next spiral, remember, think it over, just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical manager, Katie Epperson, coordinator, Reese Oliver, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com.